Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Canadian Municipal Network on Crime Prevention, I would like to welcome you to this webinar on safe growth today. Without further ado, I will introduce our speakers for today. So Elisabeth Miller, who is an urban planner with the City of Saskatoon with a specialty in urban safety. Under her leadership, the City of Saskatoon has embedded the philosophy of safe growth and the principles of crime prevention through environmental design, also called CEPTED, as a way to achieve a safer Saskatoon in the city's official community plan. Currently, Elisabeth is the Neighborhood Safety Coordinator in Saskatoon and responsible for working with communities to identify issues, carry out risk assessments and safety audits, public engagement, as well as the implementation of safety recommendations. And Elisabeth also chairs the City of Saskatoon's CEPTED Review Committee, which is a partnership of various civic departments that review all civic structures, facilities, and developments for conformance with safe growth and the principles of CEPTED. She's also responsible for carrying out any community-based safety activities in the city's local area plans, which are essentially comprehensive community-based long-term plans for a neighborhood. And the inclusion of and focus on the community is critical to a sustainable plan. And Elisabeth will be presenting alongside Gregory Saville, who is a Canadian urban planner and criminologist residing in Denver, Colorado. And if we're lucky, he'll still have this beautiful photo as the background of Colorado, which made me very jealous in gloomy old Ottawa. He runs Alternation LLC, which is an international consultancy specializing in creating safer neighborhoods with a new planning method called safe growth. He grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, and spent 9 years as a police officer in the Toronto region. He graduated from the master's program at the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University and has taught on faculties at Florida State University as well as the University of New Haven. So on that note, I will hand it over to you. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. We have a story for you today, exciting story we want to tell you, myself and Elisabeth, and we're very excited to share this with you. We're gonna both do a bit of presentation, and then we're gonna go for about 20-30 minutes, and then we'll open it to questions. Unless you have something burning you want to talk about, just give us a wave or something and we'll be able to talk to you. Elisabeth, did you want to say hello?
I did. Welcome to the webinar, all my CMNCP friends. It's been a long time. As you can tell, look at my hair. It's quite different from the one that Audrey was showing. But I look forward to sharing this information with you and having a good discussion at the end. Thank you.
Elisabeth, please don't talk about your hair, considering, just saying, okay. All right, yeah. So, Audrey, can I share the screen here?
Yep, you should have access to the screen sharing option.
All right, and let's see how that works today. I think you should see a slide in front of you that says center later. Come on. Let's try that again. And there, it should say safe growth, creating livable and safer neighborhoods in the post-COVID 21st century. I'm hoping you see that. Is that okay, Audrey? Can you see it okay?
Yep. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, great. So again, I'm Gregory Saville. Elisabeth is my colleague, friend, and workmate for 20 some years. We've been doing this stuff for a long time. And we're going to tell you the story that started, actually it's a Canadian story. It began in Toronto a long time ago. It wasn't known as safe growth then, but it actually started there. And when I was in Vancouver, I lived in Sudbury, lived in Sault Ste. Marie, Ottawa, Toronto, and then ended up in Vancouver where we had a company doing this work. And then was kind of headhunted to Florida State to do some work there. And we've been doing it in both countries ever since. So essentially it's a story that has two countries involved, has many cultures. And it essentially is about community development, neighborhood development. We tend not to use the term community as much in our work, simply because we found that by targeting our focus on local areas, we have much more impact, much more long-term impact. So the term we tend to use, and plus community is difficult to define. It can mean anything to anybody, and therefore it means nothing to nobody. So we tend to kind of focus on the term neighborhood because it has physical boundaries. It's a geographical area. And it's just kind of how we approach it in the Safe Growth movement. There is a Safe Growth network. I'll give you the websites to that when we finish the presentation. So let's get started. So this is a slide, and Elisabeth, maybe we can do this together.
Sure.
It's a slide of Port Moody, British Columbia, where I used to live, just outside Vancouver, and it's showing where they've closed the playgrounds down because of COVID and the reality of the COVID situation. So what's their COVID situation like in Saskatoon, Elisabeth?
The playgrounds have been open, if you're talking specifically about playgrounds, but our numbers are rising the last little while, and so they're cautiously optimistic that they won't have to go backwards and do any sort of shutdown. But at the moment, it's, go out only when you need to.
Yeah, is Canada in a second wave?
Yes, I would say so. That's what they're saying.
Yeah, and of course, but the United States is handling this beautifully, as you can imagine, and we're the worst in the world for a whole bunch of reasons, not the least of which is politics. But I don't want to get into politics because it makes my blood boil. So we won't do that. But none the least to say, we're in an unprecedented global situation with the pandemic, and it is changing the way people are living, the way their neighborhoods are operating, functioning, the way people are conducting their daily affairs. Here in Denver, for example, like many cities in the US and Canada, the municipal government has shut down some streets to try to get folks to walk on the streets more often. There is a massive increase in the usage of parks and trails, which is a good thing because people are getting outside, which I think is great. The flip side of that, of course, is through social distancing. We're not as close to each other. We're doing things like this, which is a whole new experience for us. And the question then becomes, what's going to happen after? Because there will be an after. I promise. Sooner or later, there's got to be an after, some way, shape, or form. There will be a vaccine somewhere, and within 6 months, a year, whenever, this is going to subside, and hopefully we won't lose as many people in the future, but we'll do our best. But the question is, so what next? How does that change things? And Elisabeth, you and I talked about this being a lynch point or a hinge when we can change the way we move forward.
Right.
Yes? Yeah.
How to build back better. So I don't know if any of you saw any of the videos that Nick Kettleson put out. And so he talks about, this is an opportunity not to just go back to normal, but to go back to a normal that's better for our communities, that's better for our neighborhoods, that's better for the citizens in our communities. And how do we do that when we reopen? How do we change? What will it look like? And how are we going to engage people again? Is it sort of the same way we've always done, hey, come to my meeting and talk about this? Or are we going to do something different? And I think Safe Growth offers something a little different, and we do some of that in Saskatoon, and so we hope to make that stronger and better in the future.
Right, and then the question arises: well, how is the current environment affecting crime? And we see an increase in many communities of home-based violence, inside the house violence, domestic violence, because people are spending more time at home. We see a decrease in some kinds of external crime, like commercial burglaries. In some cities are going down simply because the shops are closed or were closed anyway in the early months of this disaster. And you see these radically fluctuating crime rates from city to city and neighborhood to neighborhood. And that may resume when we finally get a vaccine. But our take on this is some of that is based on opportunity, simply being outside and there are things to steal, or being inside and there, family feuds come to the surface. But it's not just opportunity; it's also the way we conduct our neighborhood living, the way we conduct neighborhood life, and ultimately, what we've discovered in Safe Growth, what we believe in strongly, is that when it comes to preventing crime, small is beautiful. That the more local you get, the more effective you'll be. And if you look at crime patterns throughout any city in Canada or anywhere else, and we certainly have published a lot of research on this, the evidence-based approach, they call it, you can see that pattern very clearly, that some neighborhoods have crime hotspots, some neighborhoods don't. And the question becomes, why? Why there and not there? And many of those reasons are social, many of those reasons are not social. And our approach in Safe Growth is to say, if we try to solve local problems with a macro policy, literacy across Canada, which is a good thing, it should be done. But to say literacy across Canada is going to automatically reduce crime in these hotspot neighborhoods, the empirical evidence doesn't actually show that. So the question is, what does the evidence show? And so what we're going to talk today about is one particular program that's a targeted approach to neighborhood safety that actually we have had tremendous success with. So having said that and put the context of COVID over our umbrella, let me just let you see this picture. Elisabeth, were you going to do this or was I?
No, I was.
Okay, over to
So
you.
thanks, Greg. As you can tell, Greg has been my mentor for a long time, and so that is why I wanted to include him in this webinar. And this is something that we talk about in Safe Growth all of the time. And we talk about crime prevention traditionally delivered to and for people. And the picture shows what's visible in this beautiful, beautiful picture of a tree. That's the part that's visible. That's the part that everybody thinks is beautiful. And how do we deliver crime prevention in a way that goes beyond the 2 and 4? Because police and government rarely prevent crime. They basically respond to it and are reactive. The 2 and 4 programs that you've probably seen in the past, Neighborhood Watch, any of the sort of some of the programs that come out of police services that are police led, and other services that are done, they're sort of planned and done and delivered to people or for them. This is what people need. A lot of some faith-based organizations, they want to help, they want to do something, and typically it's you're doing it to or for someone. Issues with relying on the police and agencies to prevent that mean that depending on what's going on and what community you're in, a program may not fit every community. It may fit well in one community, but it does not translate to another community. It tends to be reactive. It's limited by the resources that we've got and the controls and mechanisms. It doesn't typically last. It's not sustainable. So how do we do that? These programs, the typical programs, typically work in the leaves and the branches of the tree, which you see there. And how do we do that differently? The way we approach crime prevention in Safe Growth is looking at building local capacity for people. So it's with and by, not just public engagement, but having local communities within a neighborhood come together and actually decide what it is that they want to do and change their neighborhood, connect with their neighbors in a sustainable manner that actually helps support those roots, which is what lasts. So the leaves come and go, branches get trimmed, those types of things. But if the roots are strong, if the roots are well taken care of, if we work at the roots, the tree maintains its beauty.
So in other words, if you just think of the tree from the point of view of hacking at the branches, there are crime prevention programs that kind of are very surface oriented. You do it to and for the community, camera systems, security camera systems, or improving the lighting in an area. Those can make a difference. There is empirical evidence that show those can make a difference in terms of preventing crime. The problem, of course, is they may not last a long term. They may not have the support of the community, and they do nothing to build the actual roots of the community's cohesion. So what we do is we work in the branches, but we dig at the roots. So we try not to just hack at the branches, we try to dig at the roots. And we do that through this business, what Elisabeth is saying. We work not just to and for, but we work with people as much as possible. Anytime a program is with, where you transfer that knowledge, where you build that capacity, that's kind of the philosophy of our Safe Growth programs.
And when we're working in the neighborhood and we work with them, it builds that social cohesion. People feel ownership. They become creators of public safety, and that bottom up approach is much more sustainable. So this is a small project that we worked on in Saskatoon. The top left picture is the area that was an issue. So it's a little park, and students would walk through there. At the upper left corner is a big high school, and then surrounding this green space is seniors residences, from just basic seniors condos to a kind of a level 2 or 3 at the top end of the green space. And what happened was that we were approached because the student teacher it's called STAG, Student Teacher Advisory Group. There was an issue in here. Kids were afraid of going through there. The seniors were kind of complaining. They were getting phone calls from outside. And so the STAG team thought, we got to do something about that. They picked that as their priority. So this actually was generated from the students through the high school. And I was asked to get involved. And the problem was there was some drug activity in the area. There was some perceptions of, there was some fear of crime. There was issues around the seniors not feeling comfortable in the area. The benches were getting destroyed. The garbage cans were getting kicked over, vandalized, and kids were really not very comfortable in that area, except for the people who were doing the issues. So what we did was we worked with the students and the teachers, and we completed some safety audits. You can see some kids in the top right doing some safety audits of the area. We actually had, so we worked with some of the teachers, and said the teachers then took it to some of their classrooms. We almost couldn't handle it. We had over 1,000 safety audits submitted from the high school. This is a huge high school. The middle picture on the top, those are two young students, high school students. I would have hired them in a minute, and they're facilitating the seniors group. So they're looking at, here's the area. Where do you feel safe? Where don't you feel safe? What kind of things would you like to protect in this area? What kind of changes would you like to see? And one of the big things that came out of that was, we have to protect the bunnies and the ducks. So that was that was our kind of inside joke, bunnies and ducks, bunnies and ducks. On the last picture on the top, the welding class in the high school designed and built the bench and the waste receptacle. On the bottom is the construction team, which is actually also from the high school. So there's a teacher there and a couple of students, and they built the concrete structures, the bases for the bench and the waste receptacle. And then we had a donation of a sign that was etched by a local company. They wanted to do something, but they didn't want their name on anything. So basically this just talks about Dan Warden Park and the work that we did in there. And the next slide, so we had a celebration at the end when everything was installed. And so we're in the park, and we made hot dogs and everything for the students. We did it at lunchtime because they often come over there, or they go through to the mall. And this picture is Tim Stone is a local, the fellow in the center is a local radio personality, and then a bunch of students there. And anecdotally, what we found afterwards was that the place was actually treated a lot better than it was. You can go to the next slide, Greg. The seniors also had a bake sale and they raised about $300 and donated it to the work that was done in the park. That seniors said they felt safer in the park. In fact, they were so appreciative of the work that the high school students did that they actually made this poster, a thank you poster. Like, it was a big Bristol board poster, and they cut out pictures from magazines. And all the kids on the poster looked like they were 12, and the students thought it was just so cute that they hand delivered it to the high school saying thank you. And that's a connection that didn't exist before this project, and was maintained for a period of time afterwards. I don't know how strong it is now, but there was less criminal activity in the park. There was less, people felt safer. There was increased sight lines, and lots of students, we went back a number of times, lots of students using the new benches. There was a little bit of graffiti vandalism, but they tended to take care of it quite quickly, the Parks branch, because they really wanted to maintain these beautiful benches that really added to the park and looked good.
And if you notice this, a characteristic we see in all safe growth programs in different cities across North America is when we get to the neighborhood level and we talk about small is better, working at the local level, and we do the width as opposed to 2 and 4. What happens is the residents, in this case the students, take more ownership of the area, which is why Elisabeth's describing this area needing less maintenance. Is because they're not going to vandalize their own bench that they did themselves, as opposed to the city putting it in, or maybe having a police program that's from the outside. It's a totally different sort of sense of respect, and so the neighborhood starts to build its own sense of pride. And that matters a lot. And building pride in a neighborhood, building social cohesion, or what sociologists call collective efficacy, that's the key to making things last much longer term. So this is a great example in Saskatoon. We've got hundreds just like it, but there's a great example of how you can do that in a relatively straightforward fashion.
And
So
sorry, Greg. And the partnership included that high school. It included, so we have a public system and a separate system. And those high schools, they're about a block and a half apart, had never actually worked together officially, ever.
Right.
And so the schools themselves brought that up and said, wow, this is great.
Right.
Like, we've never had our students work together. We've never had our teachers work together. So there was the seniors, the community association, the high school, the kids themselves. And we actually taught some of the kids some of the processes through getting information, and how do you get information from people? How do you talk to people? What kind of information do you need? How do you go about solidifying those partnerships, so that the next project that came up every year, that group, the student teacher advisory group, they always picked a different project to work on. Although this one took more than 1 year, the kids actually stuck to it. The ones that we started with, the high school students that we started with, stuck with it to the end. So that's how much ownership they felt in this project.
And my hope is, and I don't know if this is true, there's no empirical evidence for this, this is just a thought I had. I'm not sure what you think about this, and I'd love to hear questions from the audience at the end of this about this point. Is I'm wondering that now that we're getting outside more with COVID and doing the walks and the trails, and that it exposes us to more neighborhood activities, more neighborhood facilities, and it lets us start to think about how we might connect more with people like the local schools and the local churches and the local community centers, or whatever it happens to be. That business of getting out more itself may trigger this awareness more after COVID than before. Maybe I'm wrong, and I don't know. I'd like to have folks talk about that after. But essentially what I want to talk about here is, so this is a great single project, and we have many others across North America. We have a bunch of great project work going on in North Battleford now, and I see Ryan Mackrell is here, and he's one of our Safe Growth certified trained advocates, and he's a great champion in North Battleford. Maybe Ryan can talk afterwards. We're finished talking about some of the work they're doing in North Battleford with this kind of thing in mind. But the question you're wondering right now is, okay, that's great, that's a nice project. How do I do it? How do we make this a way to do prevention on a long-term basis? And so that's where Safe Growth comes in. And so I'm going to briefly run through the basic principles of Safe Growth. I won't give you the full course because it's a long 3-month thing, but it'll give you an idea of what the principles are. So essentially what we have in Safe Growth is we have 4 different strategies, and they all come together. So the top one is called Second Generation CEPTED. If you don't know, CEPTED is an acronym for Crime Prevention Through Environmental Design. It's been around in Canada since, well, the first workshop on CEPTED was in 1975 at the University of Toronto. And then there was a course run at Simon Fraser University through the RCMP in 1982 for a couple of years. And then gradually it started to show up in various municipalities. The Toronto METRAC safety audits were an extension of that early work. And so it's been around a long time. But second generation hasn't been around a long time. It's basically the social part of crime prevention through environmental design. It's the social programs that you see everywhere. Literacy, for example, would be one of them. But these social programs are specifically tailored on the local neighborhood. They're not broadly offered. They're targeted based on the data collection and your research, and you develop your strategies, or your diagnosis drives your prescriptions. So the second generation is the social story, which is the motives to crime, how you cut crime motives. And then the second level there is first generation CEPTED, which is old style crime prevention through environmental design. And I'd love to talk about the CEPTED movement in the last 6 months and what's been happening and some of the movements that have happened there and some of the responses to that. We can do that later, maybe. But essentially it's the creation of safe spaces, in this case with the bench that the kids themselves were doing some of the space. The third level is the activation. How do you engage people? And there's a lot of great work on activation, work that was done years ago by people like Jim Deers out of Seattle, Wendy Sarkisian, who's written about community participation. And there's lots of strategies around activation, but that's key to engaging people who maybe don't want to be engaged. Maybe they're new immigrants to Canada. Maybe they're in a poor neighborhood. Maybe they're afraid of going outside. There's many reasons, and there are strategies we use to get them engaged. And then the last is the idea of capacity building, which is the 2-4 with, doing it with people. And we establish this through many different strategies. We have not only training, there's nonprofits that can be set up, there's specific programs that can be tailored, but that's the general model of what the safe growth method entails. So we have 4 steps we go through. Step number 1 is you establish multi-agency partnerships. Many of you will be familiar with this, because multi-agency partnerships are a common thing in crime prevention. That's why we have success in crime prevention. It's because we get groups to work together. So we just finished a safe growth program in the city of the city of Calgary. One of our safe growth advocates is Anna Broussard. She's a planner there. She was the one who kind of coordinated that. We all did it virtually, of course, but they actually got out to the neighborhood, into the Forest Lawn neighborhood, the International Avenue, if you know the city at all. And so we had a partnership with the Calgary Police, who are terrific. We had the 12 Community Safety Initiatives, which is a community of 12 neighborhood groups that collaborate together to tackle crime and safety. 12 CSI, they were a great partner, and so forth. And so you establish this multi-agency partnership. Now, it's not like a hub concept like in Prince Albert. We had some folks in our last safe growth class in Prince Albert saying that it's actually not even running anymore. And plus it was very top down. So I'm not going to criticize that. I mean, there are ways that can work really well, but it's not the same as that. It's a local base. It's very neighborhood oriented. It's small is beautiful, to come back to that phrase. So that's step number 1. Step number 2 is to train the teams, to get focused people with knowledge and how to do this, the technical pieces of the story. So they need to learn how to analyze crime, how to use computers, how to use our mobile GPS auditing app, which we've developed to do this, teaching them the concept of safe growth, of CEPTED, and so forth. And we have all these different representatives from the city, from the police, from the neighborhood, subject matter experts. So in other words, your teams need to be a microcosm of the larger community, so that it's very much working with people. So that's the next step, is setting up the teams. The third step is establishing neighborhood plans. So each neighborhood has its own plan, not only a project to deal with the benches in the Saskatoon story, but a long-term 3-year, 4-year, 5-year plan as to what we're going to do as a team. And there's one for Saskatoon on the left there. There's another one on the right for New York, public housing we did last year. And so the plan, it's driven by the plan. The plan has deadlines, it has a schedule, it has an evaluation mechanism. So it's very sort of social scientific. So you're teaching folks how to think strategically, which is part of the capacity building, part of the transferring of ownership. And then finally, to sustain it in the long term, we have something called the Livability Academies, which I won't get into too much right now, but essentially it's more of a long-term community voluntary once a week event that's established in neighborhoods to sustain this in the long term. I won't get too much into that right now, but essentially that's what the Livability Academies do as the third key. So let me give an example. So here's where the whole thing started, at least the early years of it. Before Safe Growth was formulated in 2007, which is when I kind of wrote the first piece. I delivered at the Canadian Institute of Planners convention in Quebec City, and then later with the United Nations Habitat Program in Santiago, Chile. And from 2007 onwards, that's when we started to really implement the model. But there were early examples of this back in the late 90s. And this one started actually in Toronto, in the area of North Toronto called the Jane Finch corridor. If you know Toronto at all, it's a notorious area that has about 60 high-rise towers, about 60 or 70,000 people, many first-generation immigrants. When it was designed initially in the 60s and 70s, there weren't a lot of social programmings, there weren't many parks, there weren't many schools, there weren't many cinemas for the kids to go to, and so forth. So there was a lot of deficits. So Jane Finch became known as a high crime area of Toronto. So in many ways, it still is. And right smack dab in the center of it is this 3 apartment towers called the Santa Romanoway Apartments. And I went to university, York University, right across the ravine from this. So I used to visit this as part of my planning studies and look at the Romanoway Apartments and look at the Jane Finch corridor and say, why here and not there? What's going on here? What are the social conditions? What can we do about it? And we never really figured it out. But then in 1999, 2000, a colleague of mine ran a security company here and got fed up with, putting just more security guards, and then they were putting dogs, and it got crazy. So he said, there's got to be another way. This, like Einstein said, if you keep doing the same thing over and over, you're insane. And so what he wanted to do was something different. So what we did was we started doing CPTED. And I realized really quickly that physical CPTED wasn't going to do it. We needed to do the social stuff. So this is where we started. And because you can see it had a crime rate many, many times higher than the rest of the country. Interestingly, the crime statistics from the police department were not useful here because the residents weren't reporting crime to the police because they're afraid of the police, because a lot were first generation immigrants, a lot of African Canadian immigrants from parts of Africa, Somalia, and so forth. So this was an issue, and the question was, how do we do that? So what we did was we went in there, but we had to deal with the infrastructure. The problem of social dysfunction and infrastructure was broken. There was one of the tennis courts, which is in disarray. So we started to work with the residents. We started to come up with planning. So we taught them how to do surveys. We taught them how to do safety audits. We taught them a bit about CPTED. And eventually what happened was they started to figure out that they could organize themselves, and they could get their act together by laying out a plan, getting some data, and creating a plan. So they started by hiring an organizer named Stephanie Payne, who was a tremendous organizer, and then by setting up an organization, an association, which we had recommended in our initial reports. And they called their association the San Romanoway Revitalization Association. And essentially the idea was it would coordinate a lot of these activities, but have a plan to do that. It initially got funding from United Way as seed money. Today, though, it has its own budget and raises its own money. So it's relatively self-sustaining. Of course, any nonprofit like this is always ebbing and flowing with the current winds of grant work, but that's normal. But the key, I think, is it's 20 years later and it's still operating. There's still a website. They still have programs. So the Romanoway Association was how the whole thing got started. So they were doing it. They had expert assistance. They had a recommended report with recommendations, and they ended up having the support of the police and so forth. But essentially, they were driving the show. That's the key. Then what happened was they started to work on their hood. And so they started by realizing there was a lot of no man's land around it, a lot of vacant land. Nobody had anywhere to go. So what they did was they started to create some public spaces, some communal shared public spaces. And this is part of the first generation CPTED strategy, which is you create activities in areas that may seem unsafe, but you create a physical space, like a public, in this case, a public park area for the kids. And then you program it with activities so the kids can go there, so the mothers can watch the kids as the kids play. And you start to build some kind of local life outside, so people aren't so afraid to go outside. And this was one of the parks photographs I took last year. Here's some more photos I took last year. Of course, they have mural programs, top left-hand side. They have a community, a play area for the kids here on the right with a little display area where the kids can come and play for like a childcare situation. Here's the community gardens. They opened up those, which were very successful, particularly among the seniors there. And a lot of the folks who were used to growing things, growing their own produce, now they have community gardens there. They can grow their own stuff and sell their own stuff. So it really changes the dynamic of the outdoor space. And then they started to do things like social programs and recreational and art programs, things like music programs for the kids. And here's a photography exhibit done by the local artists trying to display their own community to give a sense of pride and ownership. Interestingly, when that started to happen, the association started to reach out to some of the corporations around. And this is a donation by a Canadian, I think it was Odeon or Cineplex Cinemas, who went in there and helped build a multi-purpose room with a big movie theater, so the kids can actually have movies shown there. And here's the opening of the facility with some of the kids and one of the local police officers and the owner of the properties on the left there and so forth. So it really transformed how they did their own affairs. And it wasn't always the government, doing things for them or you kept creating a national program, which you're fine, but that's not what happened here. What happened here is they tailored their stuff to deal with their own problems. And here's one of my funnest stories, which is the top left is the basketball court, which was in disarray. And when we surveyed them, I did the survey, one of the survey questions, myself and an academic from Ottawa University, George Rogakos, was hired later to do multi-year studies on this. And he had some of the surveyors go out and they weren't getting success. And so when they finally got the residents themselves to survey, the kids were saying they didn't want basketball courts, they wanted tennis courts because of the success of Venus and Serena Williams. And so we realized that that's what the kids want. Why would you build something the kids don't want? If you're doing it with them, do it with them. And so we ended up building these tennis courts, these beautiful professional tennis courts. And within a very short time, York University's athletic department started sending instructors over to teach them tennis, and they set up tennis camps. And today, the summer tennis camps at San Manaway are among the most popular summer tennis camps for young people across the whole city, which of course is breaking the old stereotype of San Manaway being the high crime area. It still has crime, but nowhere near what it used to. And to our amazement, about 5 years ago, when they opened the summer tennis camps at San Manaway, guess who showed up to open it? Serena Williams, who was performing at one of the tennis competitions in Toronto at the time. And so this was a tremendous success story. And for the criminologist, to me, the question is, what did it do? Well, over the 6-year period that George Rogacco studied it, we had massive declines in violent crime, declines in property crime, in fear. Neighborhood contact went up, and today this is 10 years ago, 15 years ago, that has even continued more. So we've had tremendous success with turning this neighborhood back from the brink of crime using this kind of a program. We've replicated this in many, many cities across North America. So I'll end it there, and I'll just I'll give you some resources if you want to follow this. Actually, Ryan, here's a story of North Battleford that we did a blog. So we do have a blog, and this is some of the stories about the Battleford story. But we've got about 10 years of blogs. There's probably 1,000 blogs covering many of the stories and many of the case studies we've worked on. And you can read about this if you want to follow it. That's the blog website, and it's usually once a week or once every 2 weeks. We have 3 of us who blog, and anybody else who we can rope in to write up a story about what's happened in their neighborhood and some of the different angles on how safe growth applies to recreation and to elders and to seniors and to Aboriginal groups and so forth. And those stories are all in that blog. And then the second thing is the website. And the website is basically has the resources that we use in our training, which are some of those are behind the firewall, but a lot of stuff is in front of the firewall with videos and PowerPoints and all the rest of it. So you can read about it there. And I'm going to stop there. There's a book we wrote too. It's on Amazon if you want to get it. And it's some of the early case studies. Elisabeth has a chapter in here. We have a chapter on Red Deer, a chapter on New Orleans, where we had a tremendous success there and so forth. So anyway, that's our story. We're going to stick with that.
It's our absolute pleasure to host this webinar, and thank you both for taking the time to present today. Look forward to connecting with everyone in a future webinar.